The squad car smelled of stale coffee and damp leather, a familiar, comforting musk to Officer Ben Carter. Tonight, like most nights in the quiet, rust-belt city of Blackwood, the patrol was a monotonous loop of shadowed industrial parks and dimly lit residential streets. Ben, a man whose face seemed perpetually etched with a weary stoicism that belied his 30 years, had seen enough mundane tragedy to last a lifetime. He was partnered with rookie officer Elena Rodriguez, fresh out of the academy, all nervous energy and textbook idealism. Another dead-end alley, Officer Rodriguez, Ben mumbled, nursing a cold thermos of coffee. See? Nothing out here but bad investments and war's intentions. Elena, however, was staring out the passenger window, her brow furrowed. Did you hear that, Officer Carter? Hear what? My stomach growling? No, a sound. Like a single, soft chime. And there's a light. Ben followed her gaze. They were passing the defunct Blackwood Municipal Archive, a towering, Gothic structure abandoned after a mysterious fire 20 years prior. Locals whispered it was cursed, a tomb for forgotten records, and, some said, lost souls. A single, almost imperceptible blue light pulsed rhythmically in one of the blackened top-floor windows. Probably a squatter, kid, or maybe the ghost of a badly filed tax return. Ignore it. But as they drove past, the blue light intensified, flaring briefly into a sharp, painful white before vanishing. At the same moment, the radio in the cruiser sputtered to life, not with a dispatch call, but a static-laced sound that made the hairs on Ben's neck stand up. It was a rhythmic, whispering hiss, completely unintelligible. KZZZ, SSSSH, KZZZ, SSSSH. Dispatch, is that you? Ben keyed the mic, his voice tight. Only the low, mechanical his answer. Elena was gripping the dashboard. It sounds like someone breathing, officer. Ben slammed on the brakes, turning the car in a sharp U-turn back towards the archive. The airy blue light was gone, but a new sensation filled the car. A sudden, drastic drop in temperature, so severe that Ben could see his own breath cloud in the air conditioning. Check the frequency, Rodriguez. Now, Ben ordered, his usual jaded calm dissolving into professional urgency. Elena frantically toggled the radio settings. It's not on a police channel, Officer Carter. It's on a dead frequency, one that hasn't been used since the old analog days. And it's coming from inside the building. The whispering static on the radio abruptly ceased, replaced by a deep, resonant thump that vibrated through the cruiser's chassis, followed by absolute silence. The archive loomed before them, its charred stone facade like a skeletal hand reaching into the night sky. Get on the horn with dispatch, Ben said, grabbing his flashlight and unsnapping the holster of his sidearm. Tell them we're going in. Code 70. Unexplained disturbance, the archive. And tell them to check their archaic records for anything on that frequency. He didn't wait for her reply, already stepping out into the unnatural, biting cold of the Blackwood night. The air was thick with the scent of wet ash and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood. Officer Carter, wait, Elena called out, scrambling after him. Ben shone his powerful tactical light up at the towering structure. In the beam, he could clearly see a figure standing perfectly still in the same top-floor window where the light had been. It was tall, thin, and absolutely motionless, silhouetted against the inner darkness. It wasn't a squatter. It was far too still, and as the beam held steady, the figure slowly, unerringly, raised a hand and tapped the glass. To quick taps, a pause, then to more, a deliberate, prearranged signal. But the figure's face, or the lack thereof, was the thing that froze Ben's blood. Where eyes should have been, there were only two empty, dark sockets that seemed to drink the light whole. The face was an unnaturally pale, smooth expanse, like sculpted marble. Stay here, Rodriguez, Ben whispered, but the figure in the window was already gone. New plan. We go in quiet. No sirens. No yelling. Just us. He knew, with a certainty that was both chilling and exhilarating, that this wasn't going to be a simple trespasser call. This was something else. Something that had been waiting in the dark for 20 years. And it had just tapped on the glass to let them know it was ready. The heavy oak front doors of the Blackwood Municipal Archive were officially sealed with a rusted police barricade and several layers of thick, official caution tape. Unofficially, years of neglect had created a perfect point of entry. Ben located a window near the service entrance, its glass cracked and its lower sash warped by the decades-old fire. On my count, Ben muttered, already bracing the window frame. 1, 2, 3. With a grunt, he forced the sash upward. The sound of splintering would echo disproportionately loud in the dead night. He slipped through first, his tactical light slicing through the suffocating interior darkness. The air inside was stale and heavy, a combination of ozone, burnt paper, and that strange, sickly-sweet metallic odor. The lobby was a vast, cavernous space where shadows played tricks on the eye. The original fire, Ben recalled, had gutted the upper floors, but the ground level, lined with marble walls and bronze plaques, had mostly survived water and smoke damage. Elena squeezed in behind him, her breathing shallow and fast. Officer Carter, the temperature. It's colder in here than outside. Ben nodded, his flashlight fixed on the remnants of a reception desk. It's wood-scorched black. Something's drawing the heat, or pushing it away. Stay tight. I want eyes on everything. He checked his radio, whispering into the mic, "Dispatch, we're inside the archive. Disturbing atmosphere. No sign of a physical intruder, but the radio signal originated here, sending Rodriguez up to the main stairwell. I'm taking the records wing. Over. Static. Only the dead, rhythmic KZZZ. SSSSH. KZZZ. SSSSH. Dispatch is officially useless now," Ben sighed, lowering the volume to a barely audible level. "We are alone, Elena. Remember the training. Centimas. Watch the corners." They moved through the lobby. Elena headed towards the ornate central staircase. Its lower banister melted and twisted. Ben moved into the west wing, a long corridor lined with steel shelving that housed the city's oldest, heaviest records. Land deeds, city council minutes, and the notorious Blackwood Orphanage Registry, the latter a file that had been sealed for nearly 50 years. As Ben walked, the rhythmic whispering on his low-volume radio grew slightly louder, occasionally punctuated by a sound like a wet, soft slap. His light fell upon the first shelf. The files were undisturbed, coated in a thick layer of fine, grey ash. He moved to the next row. And the next. It was in the fourth aisle that he stopped dead. On the dusty concrete floor, leading from the center of the aisle and vanishing into the darkness ahead, were a series of footprints. They weren't shoe prints. They were large, barefoot imprints, their shape strangely elongated, with toes that seemed to drag slightly. And they were impossibly clean. They left a perfect, dark outline where they had melted the centuries of undisturbed ash and dust. "Elena, report." Ben keyed his mic, louder than he intended. The only reply was a sharp, high-pitched thunk that came not from the radio, but from somewhere deep within the structure. It sounded like a massive filing cabinet had been tipped over on an upper floor. Ben followed the footprints, his heart hammering against his ribs. The metallic, sweet smell intensified until it was almost overwhelming. The prints led him to a small, heavy metal door marked sublevel access, temporarily sealed. The door was no longer sealed. The old, thick padlock had been violently shed, its steel shackle curled like paper. Just beside the open doorway, etched into the thick layer of ash on the marble floor, was a perfect, intricate symbol. It was a circle bisected by a jagged, uneven line, like a fractured pupil. Ben didn't recognize it, but the moment he shone his light on it, the symbol seemed to absorb the beam. He looked down the black marve of the sublevel stairs. The whispering on his radio was now a distinct, looping sound, The rhythm no longer just KZZT, SSSSH, but something closer to a muffled chant. He waits. He waits. He heard Elena's voice, finally, over the radio, strained and high-pitched. Officer Carter, up on the third floor, the door to the main archive room. It's wide open, and the air, it's freezing, and, oh God, officer, the files, they're all hanging. Hanging? What are you talking about, Elena? They're not on the shelves. Hundreds of them. They're suspended from the ceiling by wires, like a horrible mobile. And they're swaying. Officer, I hear the thumping coming from inside that room. I hear the breathing. Ben knew he had to go to her. But the call to the sublevel was too powerful, too compelling. Those footprints were the key to whatever was in this building. He made his choice. Elena, do not go into that room. Retreat to the stairwell. I'm going to check the sublevel, then I'll meet you. Do not proceed. He turned off the main beam of his flashlight, switching to the dim, red filter. He didn't want to alert whatever was down there. As he started his slow descent into the cold, utter darkness of the sublevel, a single, perfectly folded square of pale, brittle paper fluttered down from above. Landing softly at his feet, he picked it up. It was a page torn from a very old, heavy document. Scrawled across it, in a dense, looping script that looked like dried ink or dried blood, were 3 words: he has the keys. Ben's descent into the sublevel was agonizingly slow. The red filter on his flashlight cast the narrow, concrete staircase in a wash of arterial light, making the shadows above and below seem impossibly deep. The air pressure shifted dramatically. It was no longer just cold, but felt dense, as if the oxygen itself was reluctant to move. The whispering on the radio was clearer now, the low chant cycling on repeat. He has the keys. He waits. He has the keys. It was no longer static. It was a voice, synthesized and unnaturally calm, like an automated warning system from a bygone era. Ben gripped the butt of his pistol, his knuckles white. He reached the bottom. The sublevel was a single, vast room, low-ceilinged and humid despite the crushing cold. The metallic sweet scent was overwhelming here, making his eyes water. This was the building's original cold storage, used decades ago to preserve fragile documents and old biological evidence from high-profile, unsolved Blackwood cases. His light swept across the room. It was lined with huge, archaic refrigeration units, humming quietly, interspersed with rows of heavily chained steel lockers. He found the source of the footprints immediately. They ended at one of the massive refrigeration units, Unit 17. The unit's thick, steel door was slightly ajar, a sliver of inky blackness showing in the gap. A plume of icy vapor drifted out, momentarily obscuring the area. Ben approached with extreme caution, his sidearm raised. "Police, I know you're in there. Step out. Now." His voice was a flat, unconvincing rasp in the cavernous space. He didn't get a verbal reply. But the chanting on the radio stopped, replaced by a wet, loud click from inside Unit 17. Before Ben could react, Elena's voice exploded through the radio, shattering the silence and the growing panic in his chest. "Officer Carter, it's not a mobile. They're watching me. The files are watching." Her voice broke into a terrified sob. "The covers, they're all open. And the papers inside. It's all faces." Ben winced, dropping his radio volume again. "Elena, be specific. What are you seeing? Are there people in the files?" "No. They're drawings. Crude, horrible children's drawings. And they all have that same empty face you described. The smooth, white face with the holes. They're all staring at the door. And the wires holding them aren't wires, officer. They're long, brittle strands of hair." The sound of the massive filing cabinet falling, which Elena had reported earlier, repeated thump. But this time it was right above the sublevel. Dust rained down from the ceiling. Ben had to move. He had to decide, up to his panicked partner, or into the mouth of the cold storage unit. The click from Unit 17 repeated, faster this time. He took a deep breath, fighting the irrational paralysis. Elena was still in immediate danger, but whatever was behind this thing was in the sublevel. And it had the keys. He kicked the door of Unit 17 open. The cold was absolute, blinding, instantly frosting the lens of his flashlight. The unit was small, designed to hold only large, singular pieces of evidence. It was empty save for a single item bolted to the back wall. A heavy, black, metal box. Like a forgotten safe. It wasn't the box that caught his attention, though. It was the material coating the inside walls. Not ice, but a thick, crystalline rime that looked like frozen, pale skin. And etched into this strange material, dozens of times, were the symbols Elena had described. The fragmented circle, the fractured pupil. His light fell on the front of the black box. Hanging from a heavy steel chain was a ring, and on that ring were a dozen ancient, heavy iron keys. The keys that would open every locker in the sublevel. And stuck to the chain, pinned underneath the keys, was another piece of that brittle paper. This one was torn, and written on it in the same dark, looping script was a single word, simple and devastating: yours. Before he could process the sinister implication, the steel locker directly to his right, locker 18, began to shake violently. The ancient, heavy chains securing it rattled, and a low, guttural screeching erupted from inside, like fingernails dragging across chalk. On the third floor, Elena screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated horror that was instantly cut short. The radio went silent. The chant was gone. The only sound in the sublevel was the rattling of the chains on locker 18, and Ben's own ragged, terrified breathing. He was alone, locked in the tomb with the keys to the nightmare he had just unlocked. The screeching from locker 18 was wet and high-pitched, like 1,000 starving insects trapped behind the thick steel. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was too mechanical, too rhythmic. It was a lock giving way under internal pressure. Ben stood frozen, the ring of archaic keys heavy in his left hand, his flashlight beam fixed on the rattling locker. Above him, the immediate silence after Elena's scream was a heavier dread than any noise. His partner was gone, or was captured, on the third floor. But the thing that was driving this, the thing that wanted to be found, was in the sublevel. He spun on his heel and sprinted back towards the stairs. Survival instinct and loyalty outweighed the investigative pull. Elena. He took the steps two at a time, the heavy iron keys clanging like morbid wind chimes against his equipment. He didn't slow down as he passed the open door of the sublevel access, only glancing back long enough to see a dark, oily slick beginning to seep out from under locker 18, spreading across the dusty concrete. When he reached the ground floor, the ambient cold was slightly less severe, but the air was now thick with an acrid, metallic smell, the scent of an electrical short mixed with the sweet, coppery tang of fresh blood. He raced through the record's wing, ignoring the shadow play of the abandoned shelves, and reached the central staircase. The grand, soot-stained marble stairs seemed endless, and the climb was exhausting. Halfway up the second floor, he found the first sign of struggle. Elena's flashlight lay on a landing, still burning, illuminating a smear on the marble that was unquestionably blood. It was a distinct, deep crimson, and it hadn't dried yet. "Elena, answer me," Ben yelled, his voice strained. No reply, only the hollow echo of his own fear. He reached the third floor. This was the floor that the original fire had consumed most completely. The ceiling beams were exposed, the floorboards unstable, and patches of the ceiling had collapsed, opening the archive to the cold night air. The source of the horrific mobile was immediately clear. The door to the main archive room stood wide open, revealing a nightmare tableau. Hundreds of heavy manila files were indeed suspended by long, coarse strands of dark hair from the broken rafters. They hung perfectly still in the zero-draft air, their covers all opened, exposing the interior documents. As Ben approached, his light sweeping the scene, he understood Elena's description. Inside each file, drawn in what looked like charcoal or burnt ash, was a frantic, crude sketch of a face, the smooth, wide expanse, the two terrible, empty sockets. Every single one was turned outward, fixed on the doorway dot and the thumping. The sound that had preceded Elena's scream was now a steady, dull thud-thud, thud-thud. Coming from behind a makeshift barrier of fallen shelves at the far end of the room, Ben stepped into the archive room, the silence of the hanging files deafening. The sweet, metallic smell was strongest here. He could see now the source of the wires. The hair was black and thick, impossibly long, and anchored to the rafters by knots that looked surgically tight. He scanned the area for his partner. There was no sign of Elena. He checked behind a broken cart, under a collapsed beam. Nothing. He moved toward the source of the thumping, his red-filtered light cutting through the oppressive darkness. As he rounded a stack of scorched filing cabinets, his light fell upon her. Elena Rodriguez was slumped against the wall, unconscious, or possibly worse. Her service weapon was still holstered. Her face was pale, glistening with cold sweat, and her eyes were squeezed shut in terror. But she was breathing. She was alive. Just above her head, taped to the wall with a piece of the same brittle, ancient paper, was the source of the rhythmic noise. It was a small, child-sized wooden heart, painted black, hanging from the wall by a single, thin piece of wire. A slow, precise drip of a viscous, dark fluid, that sweet, coppery-smelling blood, was leaking from a pinhole in the wood, landing on the floor with the steady, chilling thud-thud, thud-thud. Ben realized the thing had orchestrated her terror meticulously. He knelt to check her pulse. But before his fingers could reach her neck, he heard a new, distinct sound, the squeak of a heavy, metal wheel rolling across the floor. Coming from the shadowed entrance he had just passed through. Ben froze, his light pointed at Elena. He knew he was exposed. Then, from the darkness, a voice, a smooth, deep, utterly neutral monotone, spoke. It was the same voice from the radio, the one that had chanted, "He has the keys. You chose the girl, Officer Carter. But the key belongs to the archives." Ben slowly raised his weapon, turning his head, but not the flashlight. He saw it, the silhouette of the tall, pale figure from the window. It was standing just outside the threshold, pushing a small, ancient wheeled cart, the kind used to transport files, into the room. The figure's hands, thin and elongated, rested on the cart. On the cart itself, neatly stacked, were the files that Ben had searched for in the sublevel, the entire Blackwood orphanage registry. "Let's go, officer," Ben said, his voice flat with professional steel, masking the terror that was gripping him. "Drop the files and put your hands where I can see them." The figure didn't move. It didn't speak again, but simply tilted its smooth, featureless head. Ben felt the hair on the back of his neck rise, not from the cold, but from the sudden, chilling understanding. The orphanage registry files were not stacked on the cart. They were stacked around a single, small form that sat in the middle of the cart, draped in a black shroud. And the small form was gently rocking back and forth, as if being quietly soothed. Ben kept his weapon trained on the tall, pale figure. The light from his red-filtered beam was weak, lending a hellish cast to the scene. The figure remained unawingly still, its blank face tilted, as if silently assessing Ben's threat level. "Step away from the cart, slowly," Ben commanded, his voice tight. The figure didn't comply. Instead, one long, thin hand reached out and deliberately swept aside the black shroud covering the small form in the cart. Ben recoiled, a gasp catching in his throat. It wasn't a body under the shroud, but a doll, a grotesque, antique figure carved from dark, scorched wood. It was crudely fashioned, with articulated limbs, and its face was smooth and white, bearing the exact same terrible lack of features as the figure before him, just two black, empty sockets where eyes should be. The doll wore a dusty, tattered dress that looked like a child's burial gown. The chilling revelation was the rhythmic sound of the thudding. Weeping Heart had stopped. The doll wasn't moving, yet the cart beneath it was rocking gently. It was waiting for the keys, the figure said, its voice still a flat, resonant monotone that seemed to come from the walls themselves. You brought them to the door. Ben finally shifted his light, illuminating the figure fully. It was dressed in threadbare, institutional grey clothes, like an old hospital uniform. Its skin was the color and texture of bleached bone, and it had a profound, alien stillness. The keys are in the sublevel, Ben lied, hoping to buy time. They are attached to the box. The figure smiled, an incredibly slow, wide, and entirely unnatural stretch of its featureless lips, revealing rows of small, pointed teeth. You lie, Officer Carter. The keys are heavy on your belt. Ben glanced down. In his haste, he had clipped the heavy iron ring of keys to his utility belt. He hadn't noticed the weight until that moment. Suddenly, the files hanging from the hair strands began to sway violently, even though there was no breeze. The hundreds of crudely drawn faces inside the open files seemed to distort, their empty sockets somehow conveying raw, silent anguish. The figure moved, an impossible blur. It wasn't running, it was gliding, a smooth, swift motion that defied physics. It covered the 20 feet between them in less than a second. Ben reacted instantly, firing 2 round centimeters. Pang, pang. The shots echoed deafeningly in the broken room. The figure stopped instantly, less than 5 feet away. The bullets had hit. There were 2 neat, smoking holes in the grey uniform. But there was no blood. No stagger. No pain. The figure reached out one long, thin finger, touching the area where the bullet had struck. The material of the uniform stitched itself back together. The wound vanished, replaced by smooth, unblemished fabric. The archives cannot be damaged by the tools of the outside, the figure explained, its voice a soft, polite reprimand. It then moved its gaze past Ben, towards the unconscious form of Elena. The girl, the figure said, a hint of something resembling curiosity in its tone. She witnessed the arrangement. The files must be complete. Before Ben could move, the figure's hand shot out towards Elena's face. Ben didn't hesitate. With a feral shout, he tackled the figure, driving his shoulder into its chest, knocking the 2 of them into a precarious stack of charred council records. The force of the impact was like hitting solid granite. The figure made no sound, gave no ground. It simply pushed Ben back with casual, inhuman strength, sending him skidding across the wooden floor. Ben scrambled for his footing, his vision swimming. He looked back at the figure. It wasn't pursuing him. It was standing over Elena, its gaze fixed on her face. Don't touch her, Ben yelled, realizing the futility of his sidearm. His eyes fell on a thick, rusty pry bar lying half-buried in the debris. He grabbed it, ignoring the pain in his ribs, and charged. He swung the pry bar like a bat, aiming for the figure's neck. The figure moved its head only slightly. The blow connected with a sharp, metallic clang that jarred Ben's entire arm. The pry bar bent slightly. The figure looked at the bent metal, then back at Ben, its smile widening. A stronger lock, it observed. It then slowly lowered its hand to Elena's duty belt and gently unclipped her police radio. The device was still set to the dead frequency. The figure brought the radio to its blank face. A sound, not of static or chanting, but a deep, mournful crying filled the room. It was the sound of a child, utterly inconsolable, amplified, and distorted by the radio's poor speaker. The noise was physically painful. Ben clapped his hands over his ears, dropping the pry bar. The figure turned off the radio and set it neatly beside Elena. It then pointed its impossibly long finger at the stack of orphanage registry files on the cart. The files require a witness. You are now the witness, Officer Carter. The keys merely opened the way for the others. It then bent, picking up the small, antique doll from the cart. Its fingers carefully smoothed the scorched wood of the doll's face. Go, officer, the figure said, its voice suddenly soft, almost paternal. Take your girl and leave the archives. The first lock is open. The second is yours to keep. With that, The figure simply stepped back into the deepest shadow, holding the doll, and vanished. The files on the cart remained. The hundreds of hanging files remained. Elena remained. And Ben was left alone, holding the pry bar, the keys heavy on his hip, the echo of a child's inhuman wail still ringing in his ears. He knew he hadn't won. He had simply been allowed to retreat. The moment the figure vanished, the oppressive cold and the feeling of unnatural gravity lifted slightly, replaced by the acute, searing reality of adrenaline wearing off. Ben's lungs burned. He knelt beside Elena, his hands flying to her neck to check her pulse. It was weak, rapid, but steady. She was alive, in shock. The immediate priority was extraction. He hefted Elena's limp body into a fireman's carry. She was slight, but the exhaustion and the oppressive atmosphere of the archive made her feel like dead weight. He moved quickly towards the main staircase, stepping over the threshold and away from the hanging files of horrifying faces. As he reached the landing of the second floor, the silence of the archive was broken only by his own heavy, rattling breath. He glanced down at the belt where the keys hung. The sheer weight was suddenly unbearable. He stopped, lowering Elena gently to the cold marble floor, supporting her head. He had to look at them. The ring contained 12 keys, each one ancient, tarnished iron, stamped with a different, illegible Roman numeral. They were not the brass, standardized keys of modern locks. They were relics. Ben's attention was drawn to the central key, the heaviest one. It wasn't stamped with a number, but with the same chilling symbol he had seen etched into the ash and the side of the cold storage unit, the fractured pupil. He remembered the figure's last words. The first lock is open. The second is yours to keep. He also remembered the piece of paper. He has the keys. The terror was escalating from the external, the figure, to the internal. The keys themselves. He quickly checked his surroundings. The ground floor lobby was exactly as they had left it. The service door entrance was the only way out. He had to get Elena to the cruiser and radio for backup. Forget the files, forget the sublevel, forget the archive. As he began to lift Elena again, his radio, the one still clipped to his uniform, not Elena's, crackled violently. KZZT. KZZT. Dispatch, this is Unit 2-4. Officer Rodriguez. Officer Carter. Do you copy? We are receiving strange signals on an obsolete frequency. Are you okay? The voice of Dispatch Officer Harris, a nervous, overworked kid, was the most beautiful, human sound Ben had ever heard. Dispatch, this is Carter. Code 70. We have an officer down. Not injured by assailant, but shock. Request immediate EMS and armed backup at the Blackwood Archive. We are exfiling now through the service entrance. Be advised, situation is non-standard. Repeat, non-standard. Copy that, Carter. EMS and 2 units are en route, ETA 5 minutes. The immediate relief was so profound it nearly buckled his knees. 5 minutes. He could make it. He carried Elena down the final flight of stairs. He could see the pale, cracked light of the street lamps filtering weakly through the broken window of the service entrance. Almost there. Then, a sound came from above. Not the screeching of locker 18, but a slow, deliberate series of footfalls on the main stairs. They were heavy, flat sounds, too slow for a person running, too even for an animal. Ben didn't look up. He moved faster. He reached the window, lowered Elena carefully to the floor, and spun around, pistol raised, covering the interior. The footfalls stopped. Silence. I have a clear path to the exit. Ben snarled into the darkness. You let us walk out of here, or you're going to face more than 2 rounds of buckshot. No answer. Only a cold, absolute silence that seemed to press in on him. Ben knew he was being played. The figure wasn't concerned with him leaving. It had given him the keys. He turned back to the window, forcing the warped sash fully open. He bent to lift Elena for the final time. It was then he heard the sound on the radio again. Not his radio, but Elena's, which was still on the 3rd floor. It was the synthesized, monotone voice of the figure broadcast clearly into the open air of the empty archive. The second lock requires two witnesses, Officer Carter. Ben stopped, his heart sinking. Two witnesses. The figure hadn't vanished. It had simply moved out of sight to ensure its message was received. He looked back at the darkness, then down at the ring of keys. He didn't know what the second lock was, but he knew what the second witness was. Elena. He made the terrifying realization. The keys were not for the archive. They were not for a box. They were for unsealing the knowledge, the terrible history kept in the sublevel. And they had to be used in the presence of someone who had seen the faces. If he left Elena, the figure would simply take her, completing the ritual of the two witnesses. If he stayed, he checked the time on his watch. 3 minutes until backup. Ben made the choice that defined his fate. He gently slid Elena fully through the window and onto the damp earth outside. He placed his personal radio close to her face. "Dispatch," Ben whispered into his own mic. "Rodriguez is outside. Unconscious but breathing. I am re-entering the archive to secure evidence." Carter going to the sublevel. Over. He didn't wait for the inevitable protest from dispatch. He pulled the heavy iron ring of keys from his belt and walked back into the suffocating darkness of the archive towards the metal door marked sublevel access. He had the keys. Now he was going to find the lock. Ben found the sublevel door where he had left it, the fractured padlock lying nearby. The metallic sweet scent of old blood and ash was now overpowering, and the air was thick with a palpable sense of anticipation. He didn't use his flashlight, relying on the red filter to protect his night vision, descending into the pit with deliberate slowness. The oily slick that had seeped from under locker 18 was still there, now dried to a sticky, tar-like residue on the concrete floor. The silence was absolute. The rhythmic chanting on the radio was gone. The only sound was the faint, deep hum of the archaic refrigeration units. Ben moved to the row of steel lockers. There were 20 of them, each bolted to the wall, secured by heavy-duty steel chains. The chains on locker 18 were twisted and taut, groaning slightly under immense internal tension. The figure's words echoed in his mind. "The first lock is open. The second is yours to keep." Ben pulled the massive iron ring from his belt. The key with the fractured pupil symbol was cold against his palm. He held his breath, knowing he was stepping into a trap laid not for his capture, but for his complicity. He moved past locker 18, which was shaking with minimal, shuddering movements, and stopped at locker 19. He tested the chains. They were solid. He pulled the central key, the one with the fractured pupil, and inserted it into the heavy, antique lock, securing the chains on locker 19. The key slid in with unnatural ease and turned with a smooth, decisive clunk. The chains didn't fall off. Instead, they recoiled, retracting into the steel of the locker door with a sound like metal being swallowed. Ben stepped back, his pistol leveled at the door of locker 19. The locker door began to glow faintly from the inside, a sickly, pale yellow light. It wasn't the light of a bulb. It was an ethereal luminescence that radiated heat. As the heat intensified, the air around the locker began to shimmer, and the steel surface of the door started to visibly distort. A high-pitched, thin shriek began to emanate from within, a sound that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly against the inner eardrum, causing immediate, excruciating pain. It was the sound of a living thing being rapidly desiccated. Then, the yellow light faded. The door stabilized. The screaming stopped. Ben cautiously approached the locker. The steel was cool to the touch. He reached out and slowly pulled the handle. The door swung open, revealing the contents. It wasn't a body. It wasn't a creature. It was a single, immense, perfectly preserved sheet of skin, stretched and tacked taut to the interior walls of the locker. It was human skin, unnaturally pale, smooth and hairless, tanned and preserved to the texture of parchment. Etched into the surface of the skin, not with ink, but by careful, ancient scarring, was a dense tapestry of text. Ben leaned in, shining his red light closer. It was a flawless, archaic transcription of an original birth certificate bearing the name Meredith P. Elias, born in 1968, Blackwood Orphanage. Ben felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. This wasn't evidence. This was a record. The ultimate, final record. He looked back at the key in his hand. The fractured pupil key was now humming faintly, and a microscopic droplet of the sticky, black oil from the floor of locker 18 was clinging to its tip. The figure had claimed the keys were for the archives. Not the files, but the sealed, living records of the unforgotten. Before he could process the horror of the Meredith Elias skin scroll, a deafening noise erupted from the stairwell. Sirens. Not the distant wail of the incoming EMS and backup, but a massive, sustained, ear-splitting feedback loop right above him, as if someone had placed a dozen police radios directly against a speaker. The noise was violent, a weapon. Thwomp, thwomp, thwomp. Someone was slamming repeatedly on the metal access door above. The backup had arrived, and they were trying to force entry to the sublevel, having found the damaged lock on the top door. Carter, police. Are you down there? Carter, respond. The noise was so loud Ben couldn't think. The sound waves alone threatened to shatter his equilibrium. He knew he couldn't leave the locker open. He shoved the door shut and desperately turned the key. It locked with a solid, final clunk. As the sound of the sirens continued to tear apart the silence, Ben realized that the figure had lured the cavalry, and they were about to break into the worst place in the entire archive. He had to stop them. But he had the keys, and now he knew what they were for. The sound of the forced entry above was immediate, overwhelming, and utterly destructive to the fragile calm Ben had maintained. The air in the sublevel vibrated with the shriek of feedback and the deafening, pulsing bass of the sirens. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling as the heavy metal door above was violently struck, lightly by a ram. Cr ash. Crash. Crash. Police. Open UP. We know you're in there. A billowing voice, amplified by a megaphone, cut through din. Ben slammed his hands over his ears, staggering back from locker 19. The frantic energy of the noise was having a terrifying physical effect. The glass faceplates of the old gauges on the refrigeration units were spontaneously exploding inward, showering the floor with shards. He had less than a minute. If the police breached the door and poured into the sublevel, they would be exposed to whatever supernatural pressure the figure was generating. Worse, they might be perceived as new witnesses to the archive's secrets. He looked wildly at the stairs, then at locker 18. The tension around the locker was now extreme. The steel chains were no longer rattling. They were vibrating at a high frequency, singing a low, musical whine. The sticky, dark residue beneath it began to bubble, giving off a sharp, ammonia-like scent that fought with a metallic sweetness. Ben realized the true horror. The intense noise and presence of new, terrified people above was fueling the internal entity in locker 18. Forcing the lock. He had to get to the door. He scrambled up the stairs, fighting the vertigo induced by the noise. The moment he reached the top landing, the door frame gave way with a splintering, deafening tear. To uniformed officers, big, heavy men in tactical gear, tumbled into the record's wing, momentarily stunned by the immediate drop in temperature and the absolute darkness Ben had preserved. Clear. The first officer, Sergeant Donovan, yelled, his breath fogging the air. We got a sublevel entrance down there. Watch your step. Wait. Ben screamed, sprinting toward them, his red-filtered flashlight beam a tiny, useless spike in the overwhelming darkness. Don't go down there. This place is compromised. Get out. Donovan, seeing a man in a police uniform sprinting towards him from the shadows, instantly reacted to the perceived threat. He snapped his weapon up. Hold it right there. Drop the weapon, Carter. Who the hell is he? Johnson? Before the second officer, Johnson, could answer, the entire ground floor roared. The sound didn't come from the police. It came from locker 18 in the sublevel. It was a deep, guttural expulsion of air and metal. The chains securing locker 18 snapped like thread, recoiling into the wall with a sickening shik. The locker door didn't swing open. It was blown outward, flying up the stairs like a projectile. The noise of the flying metal was instantly followed by the sound of thick, rapid movement in the dark sublevel. Sergeant Donovan and Officer Johnson heard the sound from the depths of the building. Their faces, pale in the weak light filtering from their helmet calms, betrayed their confusion and fear. "What the hell was that, Carter?" Donovan demanded, his weapon still aimed at Ben. Ben didn't answer. He looked past the two stunned officers to the corridor they had just breached. The sirens outside were peaking, turning the air into a physical weapon. Then, a high-pitched, thin shriek, similar to the sound when he had opened locker 19, erupted from the sublevel. But this shriek was layered with a horrifying, manic laughter. A new scent flooded the room, overpowering the metallic sweetness. The stench of rotted meat and ammonia. The true smell of the unsealed. Donovan and Johnson immediately aimed their lights down the sublevel stairs. "Back up." Donovan roared into his shoulder. "Mike, we have an unknown subject emerging from the basement. Armed, possibly non-human." Before any other unit could respond, a thick, black, viscous tendril shot up from the sublevel, moving with impossible speed. It wasn't a limb, it was a flexible column of that dark, bubbling residue Ben had seen on the floor. The tendril wrapped around the neck of Officer Johnson. He didn't scream, he only made a choking sound, his hands frantically clawing at the thick, cold material. "Johnson!" Donovan yelled, firing his weapon wildly down the stairs. The rounds had no effect on the substance. The tendril tightened its grip on Johnson, and with a terrible, wet sound, it pulled him backward, dragging him over the top step of the sublevel axis and out of sight. Donovan stared into the black hole of the sublevel entrance, his face a mask of paralyzing horror. Ben used the fraction of a second to shove Donovan hard against the wall, knocking the sergeant's weapon away. "I told you to stay out," Ben screamed, grabbing the sergeant's discarded flashlight. He backed away from the stairs, his eyes fixed on the darkness. He could hear the thrashing and gurgling sounds of Officer Johnson's final moments echoing from the sublevel. In the midst of the chaos, the police radio on Donovan's uniform crackled to life, clearly overriding the static and sirens. It was the smooth, monotone voice of the figure. "The second lock requires 2 witnesses. The keys remain yours, Officer Carter. The archive is now active." Ben looked from the open sublevel entrance, now silent save for the dripping sounds, to the 2 new, heavy iron keys that had somehow been added to the ring clipped to his belt. The horror was no longer contained. It was out, and it was escalating. Sergeant Donovan, his tactical gear suddenly useless and heavy, was hyperventilating against the soot-stained wall. The sudden, violent abduction of Officer Johnson had shattered his professional veneer. He stared blankly at the sublevel entrance, where only a viscous, glistening slick remained on the top step. It pulled him down. Donovan choked out, his voice hoarse. That wasn't human. Ben, ignoring the external trauma and focusing only on the escalating operational failure, dragged the heavy steel service cart they had used for the initial entry and rammed it over the mouth of the sublevel entrance. It was a futile gesture, but necessary for a moment of control. "We move, Sergeant," Ben snapped, grabbing Donovan by the arm and hauling him to his feet. "Your backup is outside. We are exfiltrating now." He propelled Donovan toward the service entrance, where the broken window offered a tenuous connection to the outside world. The sirens were still screaming, but the sound was already being distorted, pulled into the archive's internal chaos. As they reached the entrance, Ben checked his belt. The key ring now held 14 keys. 2 had been added during the breach, heavy, new, dark iron. He realized the terrifying exchange rate. 1 key for every new witness exposed to the archive's truth. 1 key for Johnson. 1 key for Donovan. He shoved Donovan out of the window first. "Go," Get to the cruiser. Tell them no one goes near that building until I say so. Donovan scrambled out, coughing and gasping in the relatively cleaner air. Ben paused, straddling the window frame, taking one last look into the gaping, pitch-black maw of the archive. He had the keys. He had the knowledge of the first lock. He had a witness outside. He needed to destroy the evidence. His eyes fell on the abandoned Blackwood orphanage registry files on the cart on the third floor. He knew those records were the figure's ultimate prize. He pulled back, ignoring the desperate shouts of Donovan and the incoming officers outside. He ran back into the lobby, found the main stairwell, and began his ascent. The third floor was eerily quiet. The hundreds of hanging files had stopped swaying. They hung perfectly still, the faces inside staring at the center of the room. Ben reached the cart, holding the orphanage registry files. He grabbed the top binder. It was old, brittle, and heavier than expected. The doll was gone. He pulled out his lighter and focused the small, hot flame on the corner of the binder. The thick paper resisted the heat, but eventually, a small, hopeful flicker of orange caught hold. FZZZ. The flame was immediately extinguished by localized, intense blast of cold air that erupted from the hanging files. The files themselves began to quiver violently, and the hair strands suspending them coiled and retracted slightly, pulling the files higher. The entire ceiling of the archive room began to groan under a sudden, impossible weight. Ben heard the same rhythmic, whispering chant from the dead frequency. But this time, it was being spoken by the hundreds of faces in the files, a chorus of sibilant horror. The keys, the records, the witness. No fire, no exit. He realized his mistake. The files were not paper. They were a part of the archive's living infrastructure. A large section of the fire-damaged ceiling above the central cart suddenly collapsed with a violent crack. A massive wooden beam, charred and heavy, swung down, narrowly missing Ben's head. He ducked, scrambling away. He knew he couldn't destroy the records. The only way to stop the ritual was to reseal what he had opened. He turned and ran, flying down the stairs, the screaming of the archive and the amplified sirens merging into a single, unbearable sound. He burst back onto the ground floor, hitting the service window and tumbling out next to a stunned Sergeant Donovan. Ben didn't stop. He scrambled to his feet and sprinted towards the blinding headlights of the incoming police cruisers. He reached the first cruiser, a large, black and white unit, where Officer Jenna Cole was scrambling out, her hand on her weapon. "Carter, what the hell is going on?" We heard screaming. Cole demanded. Ben shoved the terrified Sergeant Donovan into the back of the cruiser. "Cole, listen to me. No one, and I mean no one, enters that building. It is sealed. If you see anyone come out, anything that isn't a Blackwood police uniform, you shoot. Do you understand?" He ripped the mic from the dash. "Dispatch, this is Carter. Code red. The archive is compromised. We need specialized hajmat, and I want an immediate lockdown on a 2-block radius. No entry, no lights, no sound." Ben took one last look back at the Blackwood archive. The single window of the service entrance was now dark. But the blue light, the same pulsing, chilling blue light he had seen in the beginning, was now pulsing, faster than before, from every single top-floor window. He looked down at the key ring in his hand. 14 keys. The horror had been quantified, and it was now his responsibility. The precinct had the nervous, agitated energy of a bomb scare. Ben sat across from Chief Commander Harrison, a man whose face was usually red with frustration, but was now a sickly, ashen grey. The interrogation room was cramped, smelling of chlorine and fear. "Let me understand this, Carter," Harrison said, leaning forward, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You are claiming that a non-human entity abducted Officer Johnson, that this entity is using obsolete radio frequencies and human hair to suspend archival documents, and that you have been given a set of ancient, cursed keys to manage this problem?" Ben, utterly exhausted but fiercely lucid, placed the heavy ring of 14 keys on the steel table. The iron clanged with a profound finality. I am claiming that the Blackwood Archive is not abandoned, Commander. It is a sealed prison for institutional horror. When we, following protocol, breached the structure, we activated something that was waiting for access. Officer Johnson was consumed by a physical manifestation of this thing, and Officer Rodriguez is currently sedated and in shock, exhibiting signs of severe psychological trauma from witnessing its effects. I have the keys that unlocked the first stage of its release. Harrison stared at the keys, then at Ben. And the figure? The one without the face? It calls itself the archivist. It is facilitating the exchange. It wants the records released. It told me the first lock is open. That means the entity from locker 18 is out. It was drawn out by the presence of outside witnesses, specifically your men. My use of the key to locker 19 created a vacuum. It sealed a record, Meredith Elia's skin scroll, in exchange for releasing a manifestation. Harrison sighed, rubbing his temples. This is a department, not a damn X-Files episode, Carter. We found Officer Rodriguez, unconscious but stable. We found Sergeant Donovan, currently undergoing evaluation for severe panic disorder, rambling about shadows and black oil. We found a single, antique child's doll on the stairwell. That's it. No sign of Johnson. No archivist. No black slick. Just an abandoned building and a whole lot of hysteria. He's in the sublevel, Commander, Ben stated flatly. And the hysteria is contagion. You need to call the state attorney general and the governor. This is beyond local jurisdiction. Harrison reached out and tentatively touched the key ring, then pulled his hand back instantly, shaking it as if burned. I've already called the AG, Carter. I told them we have a possible gas leak and 2 officers involved in a tragic accident involving an explosion near the abandoned archive. The fire was 20 years ago. The city can't handle another horror story. This stays internal. Ben stared at his chief, the realization sinking in. The department was prioritizing institutional secrecy over facing the horror. Commander, the entity is out, Ben whispered, and the keys replicate with exposure. What happens when the whole city sees what we saw? Harrison stood up, walking to the one-way glass mirror. We contain the exposure. You and Rodriguez are officially on medical leave. Donovan is on psychological evaluation. We seal the archive physically and politically. You keep those keys, Carter. You keep them silent. We will figure out what they open. Just as Harrison was about to end the interview, the intercom on the wall buzzed urgently. Commander, you need to see this, a terrified voice from the monitoring room said. It's a feed from Patrol Camera Unit 4- currently on lockdown duty outside the archive. Harrison hit the speaker button. A low, distorted crackle filled the room, followed by the sound of heavy rain and wind. What is it, officer? Harrison demanded. Commander, there's a light. It's coming from inside the archive, sir. That blue light, the one Carter reported. It's probably the wine shorting out an old transformer, Harrison growled, but Ben was already walking toward the door. No, Commander. The officer's voice was thin with terror. It's not a transformer. It's moving. It's like a swarm of fireflies, flying up and down the 3rd floor. And they're not blue anymore, sir. They're all different colors. Red, green, yellow, and they're all forming faces in the windows. The smooth, pale faces that Rodriguez described. Ben stopped at the door. He didn't need to see the screen. He knew what was happening. The figure had gathered its witnesses, the keys were set, and the first manifestation was out. The archivist was creating new records of its freedom. And Commander, the voice from the intercom continued, now a desperate cry. The radio, the patrol car radio, just turned itself on. It's set to that dead frequency. And it's playing that child's crying. It's playing it really loud. And, oh God, the cruiser's dashcam just flipped. The view is showing the windshield. and something just drew a symbol on the glass with its finger, sir. The jagged circle. It's right there. Harrison stood frozen, staring at the intercom. Ben, keyring heavy on his belt, slowly opened the door. The second lock requires two witnesses. Commander, Ben said quietly, his eyes fixed on the blank wall of the hallway. And it's not waiting for me. Ben slammed the precinct doors behind him, ignoring the shouting in the station and the frantic ringing of phones. He was officially suspended, stripped of his badge, but the heavy iron keys remained on his belt. His only mandate. Outside, the late-night streets of Blackwood felt different. The air was too still, the streetlights burning with an abnormal, yellowish intensity. He could hear the distant, high-pitched feedback of police radio static coming from several blocks away, a sound that should have been contained but was bleeding into the quiet neighborhoods. The archivist was broadcasting its presence. He reached his unmarked cruiser, parked 3 blocks away from the station. As he settled into the driver's seat, he looked at his own personal radio, still clipped to his dash. It was dead silent. The archivist wasn't talking to him anymore. It was talking to the city. He sped towards the archive, driving against the flow of nervous, hastily mobilized police units. He had to go back. The entity that had taken Johnson, the manifestation from Locker 18, was now free, and its only goal would be to reunite with the files or compel Ben to open more locks. As he drove, he realized the figure's ultimate threat. The keys were the key to the archive's true purpose. They were meant to transfer the sealed records into the world. The entity from Locker 18 was the physical vessel for the first unlocked record, Meredith P. Elias. He arrived back at the perimeter, where the street was a chaos of flashing red and blue lights. The scene was blocked by multiple cruisers and the hurried arrival of a state police mobile command unit. Donovan was gone, presumably taken to a hospital. Ben bypassed the barricades, pulling up alongside a young patrol officer, Officer Kim, who looked pale and terrified. "Carter, you're supposed to be on leave," Kim stammered, his hand shaking near his sidearm. "Status report," Officer Ben demanded. It's bad, sir. The archive itself is silent now. But the crying, that damn child's crying sound, it's being picked up on every patrol channel in the sector. Dispatch can't control it. And, look, Kim pointed down the street. 3 blocks away, at the corner of First and Maple, stood a lone streetlight. It wasn't just flickering. The light was oscillating violently between a harsh white and a deep, sickly blue. "That's not a shot," Kim whispered. "That light is marking something." "Did anyone go inside?" "No, sir." Commander Harrison made it very clear. Total lockdown. "But we found this." Kim held out a Ziploc bag. Inside was a piece of the brittle, ancient paper from the archive. Scrawled across it in the dark, looping script was a single address, 1420 Maple Street. "That's the address of the orphanage, sir," Kim said, his eyes wide. "The Blackwood Municipal Orphanage. It's been closed for 50 years. The manifestation was loose, and it was going home." Ben grabbed the bag. "Stay here, officer, and turn off your radio. Now." He spun the cruiser around and drove toward the pulsing blue light at First and Maple. The drive was short but unnerving. The crying sound from the dead frequency was louder here, vibrating the dashboard. When he reached the intersection, the pulsing blue light was blinding. 1420 Maple Street was a sprawling, derelict Victorian mansion, its gables sharp and imposing against the night sky. The orphanage. Ben parked and cut the engine. The silence that followed was absolute, save for the constant, mournful wail from the ether. He got out, moving toward the iron gates. He checked the key ring. Still 14 keys. He needed to find the manifestation and somehow force the archivist to seal it again. But he only knew how to open the locks. As he approached the gates, he saw a small figure standing motionless on the front porch of the orphanage. It was indistinct in the shadows, small and hunched. "Police, show your hands," Ben shouted. The figure didn't move. Ben advanced cautiously. As he drew closer, the figure came into focus. It was the antique doll the archivist had placed on the cart, the small, scorched wooden figure with a featureless white face. The doll was standing on the porch, its little wooden hands pressed against the glass of the main window, as if looking out. Then, the small, wooden doll turned its head toward Ben. Its face remained featureless, but the dark, sticky residue he had seen under locker 18 began to weep from the doll's eye sockets, tracing twin black trails down the pale wood. And then, it spoke. Not in the flat monotone of the archivist, but in a soft, childish voice that cracked with ancient grief. The keys, Officer Carter. Open the door. Mother is cold. Ben stopped dead. He raised his pistol, aiming at the doll. But the voice, the devastating grief in that small, wooden body, paralyzed him. Before he could act, he heard a new sound, coming from behind the closed front door of the orphanage. A slow, heavy, repeated scraping sound, like something immense and damp being dragged across the worn hardwood floor. The door, heavy and secured for decades, began to visibly buckle inward. Ben knew the doll was merely a beacon. The manifestation, the essence of Meredith Elias, was inside, growing in size and urgency. He had no way to fight something that was a physical embodiment of a record. He looked down at the keys. He knew he couldn't destroy the records, but maybe he could transfer them. He reached for the largest, heaviest key on the ring, one of the keys added after Johnson was taken. The key was stamped with the Roman numeral 2. The second lock. He had to take a chance. He turned and ran back to his cruiser, not to leave, but to find a lock, any lock, to use the new key on. He was going to try and exchange the horror to lock the first entity back into another vessel. Ben drove frantically away from the orphanage, the chilling plea of the doll echoing in his ears. Mother is cold. He couldn't fight the entity inside the house. He had to find a new lock, a new vessel, for the keys to work their dark magic. He scanned the dark, residential street, desperate for anything sealed, anything capable of holding a record. His eyes fell upon a landmark across the street. The small, iron-gated entrance to the Maple Street Cemetery. He skidded the cruiser to a halt, abandoning it in the middle of the road. He sprinted through the wrought iron gates, his flashlight beam frantic. The cemetery was vast, filled with ancient, imposing granite mausoleums. He needed something sealed, cold, and final. He found it near the back wall. A heavy, black marble crypt sealed with a thick bronze door. Engraved on the stone above the door was the single name, Elias. Ben didn't hesitate. He pulled the new key, the one marked 2, from the ring. It was heavy, strangely warm in his hand. He rammed it into the archaic keyhole on the bronze door. The key turned smoothly, clicking loudly in the dead air. He waited for the familiar, terrifying reaction. Nothing happened. The crypt door remained sealed. The key was useless. Why won't it lock? Ben screamed into the silence, pulling the key out and examining it. Suddenly, the ethereal, sorrowful crying of the dead frequency stopped. The silence was instantly replaced by the smooth, neutral voice of the archivist, broadcast from the empty air around him. The lock must be willing, Officer Carter. This place is full of finalized records. They are closed. Ben spun around, his pistol raised, but saw nothing. The archivist was everywhere, using the air itself as a microphone. What do you want? Ben yelled. The keys are yours. Take them. I want the registry to be complete. You have sealed one entry, locker 19. Now, the manifestation requires a new repository, a new place to rest. The keys do not transfer the entity. They transfer the witness. Ben's blood ran cold. He looked down at the key ring, understanding finally the sickening truth of the exchange. He hadn't locked Meredith Elias' record in locker 19. He had locked Officer Rodriguez's innocence. And the new keys were proof of his complicity. Before he could react, the ground began to vibrate. The massive iron gates to the cemetery began to shake violently. A colossal figure, tall and hunched, emerged from the shadows of the orphanage, moving toward the cemetery. It was the physical manifestation of Meredith Elias, bloated and wet, formed entirely from the black, oily substance from locker 18. Its shape was crude, infantile, but its size was monstrous, easily 10 feet tall. The manifestation fixed its sightless, pulsing blue glow upon Ben. It was coming for the keys. Ben scrambled backward, realizing he had nowhere to run. He had one chance. He looked back at the bronze door of the Elias crypt. The witness must be willing, Ben muttered to himself. He pulled the key with the fractured pupil symbol, the original key that had unlocked locker 19. He held the key up, his voice cracking with final resolve. Archivist. If I am the witness, then I am the repository. If I am the second lock, then I choose the location. He jammed the fractured pupil key, the key that opened the archive's secrets, into the lock on the bronze crypt door. This time, it turned. A searing, white-hot light exploded from the keyhole. The bronze door peeled away like foil, revealing the cold, dark interior of the crypt. The archivist's voice returned, a triumphant, smooth hiss. The terms are accepted. The hulking, oily manifestation of Meredith Elias stopped at the cemetery gates, its body dissolving into 1,000 points of bright, pulsing blue light, the same light Ben had seen in the archive window. The swarm of blue light flew across the cemetery, directly at Ben. He didn't scream. He simply stood rigid, accepting the consequence. The swarm struck him with the force of an oncoming train. The pain was immediate and absolute, not physical, but sensory. He felt every memory, every trauma, every horrifying detail of Meredith Elias' sealed record, her childhood in the orphanage, her abandonment, her final, unrecorded end, flooding into his mind. He collapsed, convulsing on the cold earth, the iron keys clattering around him. When he finally lay still, the cemetery was silent. The blue light was gone. He slowly pushed himself up. He felt strangely cold, empty, and yet impossibly heavy. He looked at his hands. They were trembling, but unmarked. He reached down and picked up the key ring. It was lighter now. The original 12 keys, plus the 2 extra keys for Johnson and Donovan, were gone. Only the key with the fractured pupil symbol remained. He had locked the entity, the manifestation of the record, into himself. He was now the new, living, and closed repository for the archive's first secret. He picked up his pistol and walked back to the street. The sirens were now returning to normal. The crying had stopped. The orphanage was dark and silent. A figure stood by his abandoned cruiser. It was the archivist, tall and pale, dressed in the grey uniform. It was holding a small, silver-plated police whistle. The archive is quiet now, Officer Carter, the archivist said, its voice entirely flat. The first exchange is complete. The second is yours to maintain. The secret is sealed within the proper lock. And the keys? Ben rasped, his voice raw. The keys are the secrets you discover, officer, the archivist said, taking a single step back toward the cemetery's shadow. And every witness will earn you another. The archivist vanished completely into the darkness. Ben got into his cruiser. He drove back to the precinct, where he would face the chief commander and the impossible truth. He drove with the knowledge that he was now the only one who truly knew the horrors of the Blackwood archive, and the only one who could open the next lock. He drove, knowing he would never be cold again.